proverb, I am because we are, is the foundation of the ACBN YouTube channel. Tap in for all of our remarkable content and ecosystem mobilization through the phenomenal practitioners and thought leaders we engage on this channel. In the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, things are not getting worse, they are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight to pull back the veil. Get ready for another amazing ACBN powered interview.
So I just want to start there, and then I'll have you go ahead and introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Okay, thank you so much, Blessing. My name is Louise Adongo. I am speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki. I am in Halifax, Jabuktuk actually, and I kind of always struggle with introducing myself because I never know if I wanted to be personal or professional or background related. But aside from what people can feel free to read in my bio and on my LinkedIn, I'm Executive Director of Inspiring Communities, which is a systems change catalyst based in Nova Scotia, but regionally represented and hoping to do our work in Atlantic Canada. I also am a biochemist. I have a graduate degree in plant biochemistry, really enjoy learning about and understanding how plants and systems in plants work, have done some research on secondary metabolites in orchids, largely for medicinal properties. So really studying medicinal plants and used in traditional, cultural, indigenous medicine, I guess I would say. And then I also have spent some time as a bureaucrat. So I've worked for the province of Nova Scotia previously. And then I've been in community probably my whole life. I come from a family that is very involved in community and cares about social justice and social development. And then me personally, I spent some time volunteering in community organizations and on boards. So that's who I am. And I'm a mom and a sister and an auntie and a friend.
I love it. I mean, you have a very impressive background, so I can see why you juggle to which one you should tap into, but I'm really glad that you let us know your extensive background. Very impressive. Again, such an honor to have you here. Can you tell us the origins of the work that you've seen in social innovation and community development ecosystems?
I can tell you from my perspective and my origins is how I would narrow the focus. So I was first introduced to this concept of social innovation from a friend of mine, Julia Sable, who had taken the social innovation generation course at Waterloo. And it was actually through Julia that I met Tim Draymond, who I think is a elder in the space, certainly in Canada. And then in the context of social finance, I actually didn't even know social finance as a concept. I think I was introduced to it by the Victor Bousselet, and I saw there was an application process for not wholesalers, but for a round 2 of investment readiness program. And I was like, what is this? I'm just going to apply for it so I can find out what it is. But once I started to learn what it was, I was like, man, we are using a lot of jargon for really simple concepts. Is I guess what I would say is that, and I have already written an article about the jargon in the social innovation space. I didn't know that I was going to be met with fresh jargon in social finance, but that's okay. Now that I understand the jargon, I understand that we have probably always been in a social innovation, social finance ecosystem, because we will always need alternatives of mainstream structures for people who are othered and who, for whatever reason, cannot participate in them. And so that is where creativity and innovation and other avenues for accessing capital, financial capital, or working in mutuality to live our best lives.
Right. So what do you think the jargon does for the community? Like, is it hindering? Is it like preventing?
Yeah.
What do you think we should do about it?
Like, sometimes I think we use words to exclude, whether we know that we're doing that or not. And so I think it is a barrier because I think, like as an example, there's somebody that I went to London on a social finance exchange with, who after like 3 days of meetings was like, I feel dumb every time I'm in these rooms because I feel like people are talking at such a level that I don't know what they're talking about. And it's usually like accountants or tax people with finance backgrounds and their, capital and cost of capital and just concepts that if they're not in your everyday, you feel like you don't understand any of this. And I was like, you're not dumb. How do you need it to be broken down? And so I, on a napkin, kind of wrote down what I understood from it. And really for me, it was my first experience with money and capital and social finance was going on Saturdays with my mother to these meetings where they would have coffee and eat mangoes and everybody would put money in the pot and everything would go around that and somebody would give an accounting of what they did with the money in the pot. Just very basic. There is no interest rates there and risk and da-da-da. It's literally just women getting together, knowing that they can't afford to do the things they need to do on their own. So they're going to do it together through this, what I'm now found out is called susus or raskas. And so I went from there and kind of told her about like, so here's traditional financial systems and here's what social finance is supposed to do. And she's like, how come they never explain it the way that you just explained it? And I guess that for me is part of it is the intention of social finance is to, I thought, or I understood, address barriers for people who are not being served by existing and traditional mainstream financial systems. But then the jargon and the access point is a barrier for people to even understand that these tools are for them. So I think there is room to really consider what are we doing here? And wasn't this the point, was to remove barriers, not create new hurdles for people to have to jump over to participate? And so I'm all for less jargon, more participation.
So it almost feels like smoke and mirrors, like it was supposed to make it easier, but it's almost less accessible because we don't understand. The community doesn't understand.
Yeah, and the burden of understanding is on the community again. The burden of signing on, the burden of registering for the webinar, the burden of connecting to, instead of making it as simple as possible. And I won't say, I won't generalize, because I've seen some really great work like that Black Opportunity Fund does. I know about the Indigenous communities and their Resilience Fund and how they've really been, not surprisingly, when the structure is by people who understand what the barriers are, then all of a sudden it's less jargon and more supports and more access. But however, when it's designed by not the people who are most impacted, then we have more jargon and more barriers and more structures. And it's a conversation around even social innovation and just really everything. It's transformation or divestment. It's like, be at the table or just keep creating other tables. And I don't really know where I land on that. I think I learned from history, and I know that every time certain communities have gone to create other tables, when it's been successful, somebody has violently come and taken it away. So I understand the divestment movements, but I'm not sure how safe and protected they will be in a context where there is space for destruction. So absolutely, we should be at the tables.
Yeah, so I guess that was my next question. What do you feel the solution is? So at the table is definitely the beginning. I think it's funny that you talked about the jargon sometimes being over our heads, because I feel like, and then you said the burden is on our community to, and I think as soon as we do get it, then they change the jargon.
Yep, it does seem like that
every few years, and it's just like, how do we keep up if you keep changing the goalposts, changing what you're referring to these, programs and things as? So I love that you touched on that. So moving on, how has it been working in Atlantic Canada as an executive director specifically?
It's been tricky. I am a Black executive director in a largely non-Black space and in an organization that is arguably not B3. So it's certainly Black-led, and we do serve Black communities in some of our programming, but it's not 100% of our programming. And so navigating that has been tough, I gotta be honest with you, from even a funding application perspective, because people will see me and see our representation on our board or among the staff and immediately be like, well, this is a Black organization. And it's like, no, it's not a Black organization. And so it's something I had raised as a concern. I was super happy when the endowment was announced for the Foundation for Black Communities, but I raised the risk right away. And I said, what happens to people like me? Because immediately everybody is funneled to the Black fund, whether or not they're eligible or not. And so I it's been interesting navigating, but I've had a lot of support, both in Atlantic Canada and from outside the region, to really just highlight this, that just because somebody is a Black leader does not mean the organization is Black, and access to resources need to continue to be available for that person and that organization in the mainstream, and not just assuming that all of a sudden, because now there's been a pathway created for Black communities and Black organizations, that those pathways are now for everybody Black.
So what do you feel like, what constitutes as B3, and then what do you feel is wrong with that formula of what considered a B3?
So I don't think there's anything wrong with the formula of a B3. And what I think is a B3 is an organization that is Black led, Black serving, and I forget the third one. The mandate is, so it's Black led, the mandate is for Black communities, and the service is for Black, because traditionally those B3 organizations have been the least resourced, least supported, most barriered by jargon. I do feel that the recognition of, if you're not B3, but still a person of color in leadership in a nonprofit role, your funding process is more difficult. You have barriers by virtue of your identity that would not be true if you were not the person that you are in the role that you're in, that is not accounted for in the ecosystem. So you kind of feel caught in the middle, that you can't access this funding, which you understand why it exists, but your path to accessing general philanthropic dollars is not the same for people that are.
So you find the challenge, like you said, almost not being accepted to both sides, not qualifying for the B3, not having access to the general funds either. That struggle. Okay.
And it's definitely a perception, maybe more than a reality, but I don't know. I feel like instinctively I've been in this situation in many different places in my life, where it's like you're the only one or you're the first one. So you're the one who's like challenging all these structures that but yeah, and so I speak from personal experience, where there's even been times where in a context of a funding application, the proposal was sent to one organization that it wasn't eligible for, and then it went to the other organization and it also didn't get funded, and there's not like really any avenue for like, okay, well, what's the feedback? How do we improve? But as I said, it's tough, and I want to name the truth of being a Black leader in a non-Black organization, because I speak not just for myself, but I know some other Black leaders in non-Black organizations, and we're having the same conversation. And I want to honor and appreciate and publicly thank the mentors, the sponsors, the people that have spoken to me in private, and the people that have publicly spoken up for me. It has absolutely made a difference.
What do you think needs to happen to make it more a fair playing ground for other people like yourself in that situation?
I think we need to talk about it more openly. It's been really encouraging I'm actually going to be speaking a little bit about it at an event called GovMaker in New Brunswick in June. But I've certainly seen in the States through Nonprofit Quarterly, there have been some current and former leaders who are talking about it more openly, about leadership transitions and how it's harder to transition into a role for a BIPOC leader, and what the ecosystem needs to do to support that. And largely the biggest advice is for the outgoing leader and for the philanthropic sector, because what tends to happen is when a BIPOC leader comes in, all the funding gets pulled. Everybody's like, let's move the funding out and see. Which then what are you going to see other than somebody really struggling and suffocating? That is not the time to pull the funding back and see. That is actually the time to resource effectively, so that the person can succeed, so that people are not on glass cliffs.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy that you think that's what's happening, instead of like pushing in support these leaders in the way that they need it. So how important is the philanthropic sector and social finance ecosystem in your work specifically?
So in our work, where we try to encourage community members and community organizations to actuate and activate their work in deeper ways, and that takes better resourcing. And so our mission and vision is to center equity in systems transformation, and just like segueing from what I said earlier. So that means for leaders they need to actually be better resourced, not less resourced. And in order to do deeper work, then multi-year funding that has different accountability tools or metrics, so different measures of success than what is traditionally used. So it's not really about the number of people that you've served, we don't necessarily think, and how fast you pushed people through something. It's, what was the quality of the participation? How were people supported? What happened to the people who dropped out and came back and finished? Because when you're dealing in context of equity, then you're also dealing with harm and intergenerational trauma and just really complex lives that don't neatly fit into the way we linearly structure projects and change and possibilities. And so I think the role of social finance and philanthropy is to help to better resource those types of transformational shift in people's lives than the way in which funding and funding support has been allocated or resourced in the past. Like a simple example is honoraria for participants. So not thinking that people should be grateful and that you're doing them a favor by XYZ because they wouldn't need XYZ if they hadn't experienced the harm and the barriers that led to them not having abundant lives. So this kind of just switching who is being centered and what they need. And then in the context of funding and grants, giving as much of it early on, not this business of spend the money first and then get reimbursed. People can't carry $50,000, $100,000 on their financial statements. Those who are granting wouldn't appreciate not getting their whole salary for a year. So putting people in those positions, you wouldn't do that in private sector. It's actually one of the things that I find fascinating is if we just treated the social purpose sector like we do private sector, we might actually be in a much better place, right? Like we would love $5 million to burn. Give me that tech bro life.
You can do a lot of good with it, right?
So yeah, and sometimes it's like, let's not use new tools. Let's just take these tools over here, which somehow we figured out how to work them and use them over here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. So what inspires you most about your current work?
The people that I work with, so that my team and my organization or our organization, it's not mine to own. The conversations that I have with people in community when they understand that even though we are wondering how we're going to pay for it, we do want to do things differently. So really, our willingness to step into the space to share all the ways we've gotten it wrong so that other people don't repeat our mistakes, like go make new mistakes, don't repeat ours. And the space of trust that we're willing to build with people to support them in what they think they need to do, as opposed to us. We might have some ideas, we might have some experiences, but ultimately we want to support what the people that we work with say is important to them and support them in getting that done.
Absolutely. Are there any other challenges or barriers that you face in your work and that you're working to overcome besides what you've mentioned?
I think so. Two. One is the fragmentation and siloed way in which we consider issues. So I would say the key issues of our times is climate and equity, and they are not separate. They are actually the same, because members of equity deserving groups are also the most adversely impacted by climate events. And so speaking of jargon from before, kind of the technical expertise not really start to talk about these things as they impact and affect people as whole people, instead of having us have to segment ourselves is I think a barrier and a challenge, particularly at the community level and what community members need. And because then it comes to conversations about net zero emissions, which might be important, but at the community level and in some of the communities we work with, food security, housing, and access to mental health supports are so much more important than net zero emissions. And there is actually a way to talk about climate that does address food security and mental health supports and housing needs. And so that is, I guess, one of the challenges. And I guess my call to whoever listens to this webinar is, can we think about how we talk about things so that we can get to multi-solving instead of needing to prioritize in ways that fragment. The other one I would say is, in Atlantic Canada, at least, the conversation around social finance and social innovation is still very mainstream, still very only representing certain faces and names and individuals and ways of learning and backgrounds. And whether it means to or not, it's still a very closed group. And so one of the things that inspires me and that I'm looking forward to working with those who are interested in is, what do we do about that? And how do we bring in the creative sector into the conversation in a meaningful way, not just, for the point in time or for graphic facilitation or for some almost like entertainment value, like it feels extractive, versus meaningfully co-create and co-design, and maybe even yield space to the creative sector. And then similarly with members of equity deserving groups, certainly Black and Indigenous communities that I've interacted with, and immigrants and newcomers and refugees are some of the most creative imagination infrastructure humans I've ever met. And not being centered in conversations about imagination and building new worlds and what can we create together it's something that I think is a challenge. And I'm hoping that we can start by, so in September, Common Good Solution is hosting a social impact summit in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm hoping that we can, in that summit, have specific protected time in the agenda for members of Black communities and community organizations, or Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations, to actually come and talk about social impact right in the agenda. Because that's another challenge that happens, is this kind of a mainstream conversation, and then there's off-breaks. There's not integration and inclusion of people into the conversation that is happening.
Right. And that's the change you'd want to see take place there. Absolutely. So is there a key set of priorities in your work right now that you're working on?
I mean, yes, centering equity in our work is a key priority. We are working with youth, and we're trying to work with youth in all the places and on all the themes that we work on. Definitely climate and equity and climate, and bringing the conversation to the level of community members, not, again, bringing the community members to the conversation that the experts are having, bringing the experts to understand the community needs. And then a little bit around food and food systems. But it won't surprise me if we end up doing, again, some like integrated work, because we have selected these as our priorities, but then we have learned that housing and housing need and community well-being through recreation is something that is really meaningful to some of the communities that we work in, and transportation or mobility, as it's being conceptualized, is also a really key thing. Atlantic Canada is very dispersed.
Right, absolutely. So how do you feel about the future of social innovation and social finance in Canada?
I feel really hopeful. I'm very excited that the conversations that people are starting to have. I'm very excited that there's even a conversation around trauma and healing, and making space for how collective trauma actually impacts what we co-design. It seems like we're in just a really generative time, and I so look forward to what's to come. I think we are finally at a point where we're realizing that we need to maybe break more things, as well as build things.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of disruption happening across Canada, the various ecosystems, and like you said, it's necessary and somewhat overdue. So how would you say you're currently navigating colonial frameworks that happen, in this area, and how do you feel people should be addressing systemic discrimination, anti-Black racism, things like that?
I would say I am not navigating them well. It is not ezy work. It luckily is not lonely work. There's a lot of us in it, yourself included. So it's really tough to answer this question, especially because it feels like it's the people who are experiencing the trauma that are also the ones who have to come up with the tools. I had a friend who always would say that. She'd say, you know, I'm the person who is the patient. I'm calling 911. I have to drive the ambulance. I have to see to myself in the back of the ambulance. I have to go to the hospital. I have to be the doctor and do the diagnosis. And then I also have to treat myself. So that's how I think I would like to see it change, is more people coming in to support those who just need to take the time to heal and be
Or
victims.
allies.
Or allies, or accomplices, people willing to really stand in solidarity and be willing to risk losing something to address this, because it wasn't. I saw this thing on TikTok, this British actor who was saying that whenever people ask him about this question about systemic discrimination and anti-racism, he's like, I'm not racist and I'm the person who's experiencing this. So don't ask me, what are you gonna do about it? And
I'm not the system. Go ask the system.
Like, no, I am not the person or responsible. And so I think the making it a group effort to address and to dismantle, and then also just attend to the trauma of it all. Like, I think one of my rants that I go on periodically in group chats is this whole urgency culture burnout conversation that is very individualized and personalized, as if it's not based on systemic issues. So it's like we want to address the individual person resting, but that individual person is going to come right back into a system that is structured for harm. So how much, like, what are we doing here? So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Speaking of rants, do you have a call to action or any final thoughts that you do want to share and put out there?
I think I would say, for those who are listening, and for anyone who sees it on LinkedIn and who doesn't listen, cooperatives and mutuals were really powerful vehicles. And I don't know why they've lost kind of traction, or their narratives seem to be getting lost in society. Let's bring that conversation back. Let's talk to our children about them. Let's talk to our families. Let's talk to our communities about them, because things are about to be really hard. And depending on which quartile you're in, traditional institutions are not going to work for you. So finding the alternatives and starting to understand them before you need them is just going to be that life hack.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, and your remarkable leadership out there at Atlantic Canada. It was an honor to have you. I think that this conversation is like, you know, well overdue and important to have. So I really hope our viewers appreciate it as well. And we hope to have you back again in the future.
Thank you so much.
So we are going to close the same way that we started the interview, by acknowledging the original stalwarts of the various lands that we're on. We want to acknowledge our ancestors and those who toiled without compassion or compensation, all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders that we continue to stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So again, I want to thank you so much for being here, and for all of our viewers and followers for tuning in. So thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you so much.